Someone asked if I had any collection videos up, and I didn't, so I thought I'd create one. I thought I'd start with one of my favorite computer companies, which is Commodore. It goes from the VIC-20 all the way up to the Commodore Amigas, so I hope you enjoy it. First up, we have the Commodore VIC-20. It was released in 1981 and discontinued in 1985. It came with a standard 5K of memory, but it was expandable by cartridges from 8, 16, 32, even 64K. By the end of its production life, there were 900 software titles for it. I don't believe it was the first computer Commodore made, but I believe that it was the first that had color graphics. I didn't have one when I was a kid, but through my collecting I ended up with one, and I think it's a pretty neat little computer. Some of my favorite games for the system are Grid Runner, Frogger 07, Berserk MMX, Buck Rogers, Dig Dug, Sword of Forgol, and Avenger, which is kind of a Space Invaders clone. Even today there's a healthy homebrew community for this machine as well on the Denial forums. If you do a search for Denial VIC-20, you'll find it. There are various forms of media you could pick games or software up for this machine as well, such as floppy disks, tape cassettes, even cartridges. One of the best items that's come out for the VIC-20 is something called a Mega Cart. It takes about 6 months to get because it's again one guy working on them, and it costs about $100, but when you get it, it'll have almost 200 games on it. That's instant access since it's on a cartridge. You can see it's at the top of the box there. That's what it looks like. And if you do get a VIC-20, that's something that I would consider invaluable to get, because that's pretty much all you need to play about 90% of the games for the system. Up next is my personal favorite, the Commodore 64. I own two different versions. The one on the left is the original model, what they call the bread box, and the updated version is on the right, the Commodore 64C. It was released in 1982 at $595, which made it hundreds of dollars cheaper than the Apples and the Ataris, which made it a very successful and popular system. Over its lifetime, I think it sold over 17 million units. In 94 it was discontinued, but I'm going to say in 90 to 92 I got a 386, so that stopped being my main gaming system, but I still use it today. If there's one 8-bit computer system that you want to add to your collection, make it a Commodore 64. Just the sheer volume of games that were released for this system makes it the best. Also, if you're a purist and you want to get a Commodore 64 with a 1541 drive, make it the 1541-2, Roman numeral 2. It has a lot less issues like realignment issues that the original one had. If you don't mind going a little different, instead of being original hardware, they make SD devices for this. Jim Brain makes a decent one, about $60. Unfortunately, the SD drives aren't as accurate as the original hardware, so for some games you will have to find specific versions of those games that work with the SD devices. Or you could go my route and pick up a 1541 Ultimate. Unfortunately, they cost about $150, and they will take up to 6 months to get, just because there's one gentleman who makes them in Europe. But it is an absolute fabulous item. It's about 90% accurate when it comes to playing the games. So yeah, I would suggest picking one up. Speaking of games, my favorite genre is role-playing, and the Commodore 64 has about 90% of all role-playing games that came out for it in the 1980s. Some of my favorites, the Ultimas 1 through 6, both alternate reality games, The Bard's Tale 1 to 3, Wizard's Crown, Eternal Dagger, Fantasy 1 through 3, and both Might and Magic games. This system is just loaded with role-playing games. And there you have it, the best sales pitch I can give for owning a Commodore 64. It will remain my favorite of all time because of the fun and memories that I had playing this system when I was a child. Next up is probably the least successful of all Commodore computers, the Commodore Plus 4. It was released in 1984 for $299 and discontinued in 1985. At the time, the Commodore 64 was $199. Yes, it was more powerful. It still had 64K memory just like the Commodore 64, but it did have the capabilities of displaying 121 colors as opposed to 16 on the Commodore 64. It was also about 75% faster. It had 4 built-in programs in a 64K ROM chip. There was a word processor, spreadsheet, database, and a graphing program. The biggest drawback for this machine was it was not compatible with the Commodore 64 software-wise. Also, it had no built-in sprite hardware, so no game developers wanted to make any games for it. It was still fairly successful in Europe, where 90% of the games were made, but it's hit or miss getting some of these games to work on an American Commodore Plus 4. And next is the Commodore 128. It was released in 1985 and discontinued in 1989. The machine only had around 50 commercial games that came out for it, so you might think that it was a flop, but actually it wasn't. It sold around 5.7 million units worldwide. The reason this machine was not a commercial failure was because it was almost 100% compatible with the Commodore 64. What you could do was either hold down the Commodore key while booting this 128 up and it would automatically go into the Commodore 64 mode, or while you were in the Commodore 128 Basic, you could type Go 64 and it would automatically become a Commodore 64. Another cool feature with the Commodore 128 is it was actually had a Z80 processor in it that allowed it to become a CP/M machine as well. This also attributed to the Commodore 128's decent sales, as I believe this was probably the highest selling CP/M machine of its time. There were a few Commodore 64 games when played on a 128 that would boot right up. One was Ultima 5. When you played Ultima 5 on a Commodore 64, there was no music, but when played on a 128, it has a full, great musical soundtrack. I recently dug my 128 out of storage, so I may actually start using it as my main Commodore machine since it is compatible with a Commodore 64, and there was a few decent games that were made for it that you can only play on a 128. Up next is another one of my favorite Commodore computers, the Commodore Amiga 500. It was first released in 1987 for $699 and discontinued in 1991. It had a Motorola 68000 processor in it and came with standard 512K of memory. One of the Amiga 500's strong suits is its colorful graphics and wonderful sound. The PCs at the time could only dream about having graphics and sound like the Commodore Amiga 500 had. The early Commodore Amiga line of computers reminded me a lot of a Sega Genesis, as some of the more popular Commodore Amiga games were ported to the console, such as Shadow of the Beast. Some of my most favorite games for the Commodore Amiga are Secret of Monkey Island 1 and 2, Out of This World, Turrican 1 and 2, Dungeon Master, and the Chaos Engine. Most Amiga 500 games were played from floppy. They did release a few hard drives for the system, but unfortunately they range from $150 to $200, and the size of these hard drives are 50 meg, 150 meg, so I really don't want one of those. I thought I'd be resigned to using a floppy emulator. Lothric in Poland makes a really nice one. I mean, it's a nice item, but I was hoping to get a hard drive for the system, and I actually found out recently that a place in Germany is going to start making an actual hard drive that uses compact flash. So I'll probably be picking one of those up for sure. It also has a newer 68000 CPU in it that runs about twice as fast as a normal Amiga 500. Plus it comes with 2 megs of RAM, so a lot of the hard drive installable games that people have been releasing will actually work with this system, which is awesome. The last Commodore computer in my collection is a Commodore Amiga 4000. It was released in 1992 and discontinued in 1994. It came with Amiga OS 3.0. It had a Motorola 68EC030 or a 6840 processor in it running at 25 megahertz. They came with between 2 and 16 megs of RAM. My machine has 16 megs of RAM in it. The Amiga 4000 came with enhanced graphics. It used the Advanced Graphics Architecture or AGA chipset to achieve 256 colors. Many games utilize this. You can kind of compare it to the VGA chipset that most PCs used back in the 90s. It was also fairly compatible with the earlier Amiga games too, not 100%, but for the most part most games worked. Unfortunately, when the Amiga 4000 came out, Commodore as a company was on its way out, so not a lot of games utilizing the AGA chipset came out, but there were a few, as you can see. They actually had really nice graphics. The 4000 wasn't the only Amiga to have a AGA chipset in it. The Amiga 1200, which was released about the same time as the 4000, also had this chipset. Another interesting design was the Amiga 4000 didn't have the SCSI controller in it. It actually used the standard IDE controller used in many PCs of the time. One of the uses of the Amiga 4000 was in amateur and commercial desktop video production. Used with the NewTek video toaster and Lightwave 3D, you can make some pretty neat things. The first season of Babylon 5, all their outer space shots, this was used. As well as Sequest DSV, a lot of their external sub shots, they used a video toaster and Lightwave 3 to create these effects. Here's a fun fact about the video toaster. Will Wheaton, yes, Wesley Crusher from Star Trek Next Generation, actually worked for NewTek. He was actually part of the R&D team that helped develop the Video Toaster 4000. So just a little fun fact there. And those are the Commodore computers I have in my collection. Up next, I'll show you a few of the floppy drives. Going from left to right, the first one on the left is an Amiga 1011 drive. Then we have a 1541 drive for the Commodore 64, the boat anchor. It's a pretty decent drive. Unfortunately, it has some issues with drive alignment. It's easy to fix if you know what you're doing. Next is the 1541-2, Roman numeral 2. It's a little better than the original 1541 drive. And last, we have the 1571. It was released specifically for the Commodore 128 line of computers. And that, my friends, is my Commodore collection. Thanks for watching, and if you like what you see, please like my video and subscribe to my channel, as more will be coming in the future. Thank you.